Okay, we'll make a start. Still some people arriving, but let's make a start. So thanks everyone for coming along today for another one of our showcase sessions. Those of you who haven't been to these before, these are basically a way in which we talk about some of our prior research within the team, partly to give you a bit more of an idea about what we do as a research team more widely, but also it's quite good timing for you thinking about your HSMA projects and what they might look like. So to give you a little bit of inspiration perhaps about some of these things. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a piece of work that I did way back in 2016, long time ago now. That was looking at modeling using discrete event simulation the referral to treatment times for bladder cancer, particularly muscle-invasive bladder cancer in Cornwall. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about today is actually sort of guidance of things perhaps not to do, as well as things to do when you're thinking about your project. So it relates quite nicely to some of the stuff that we've been talking about quite recently. So let's make a start. Share my screen. Okay, so as I say, this is a piece of work that we did back in 2016. It was a collaboration with Royal Cornwall Hospital. The project actually came about because I was doing another piece of work, a piece of very simple geographic modeling in Cornwall, and one of the people at that meeting where I presented some of the results was a urology consultant in Cornwall, and was particularly interested in the kind of modeling approach that we could offer for his own specialty. So just to give you a bit of background on this, so bladder cancer, certainly at the time of writing, was the 7th most common cancer in the UK, about 10,000 new cases per year. And between a fifth and a quarter of them invade the muscle wall of the bladder, and known as muscle-invasive bladder cancer, or MIBC. This is a particularly serious form of bladder cancer, where basically you need to start treating quite early, and need to, so a lot of bladder cancer actually you can sort of watch and wait on a lot of things, but with where it invades the muscle wall of the bladder, you need to get in there pretty quick. And the 5-year survival rate is only around 50% for those with muscle-invasive bladder cancer, because of often delays in getting to treatment. The definitive treatment for muscle-invasive bladder cancer is cystectomy combined with chemotherapy. And as I say, this was a collaboration with Royal Cornwall Hospital, who were basically interested in seeing if they could. They knew there were delays. They knew things weren't right. They knew there were delays in the process, in the pathway, and they knew that they had some ideas about where those delays might be. Turned out they were wrong, incidentally, and that was one of the interesting things that came out of the model. But they knew that they basically weren't meeting their 62-day referral to treatment target in a lot of cases, and they felt that actually there was something hopefully they could do in terms of the process to try and improve things. And it's also worth flagging up that the kind of gold standard treatment, it was not offered, certainly at the time, I don't know if it is now, at Cornwall. So if patients who were in the local area referred into the system would have various tests, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then if they were referred for treatment, they would then be referred to the hospital in Plymouth, which would actually offer the treatment, and they had their own delays too. So the scope of this project was really to look at any potential delays in the pathway from that initial referral from a GP or whoever, usually a GP, through to the point at which they would be referred on for their actual treatment at the other hospital. So they knew they had delays. They knew the hospital in Plymouth had delays. So if they could reduce the delays as much as possible, at least in their part of the system, that would hopefully enable as many of them as possible to be treated as early as possible. Obviously, for muscle-invasive bladder cancer patients, that's really important. So key questions we wanted the modelling to address were: where are the delays? Where are the key delays? What are the potential savings that could be made? Because those delays lead to much poorer outcomes, particularly for muscle-invasive bladder cancer patients. And once we've identified where the delays are, can we assess what the impact might be of doing X, Y, and Z? So this is classic discrete event simulation and what if analysis. Build a model of the system. Where are your delays? Once you've identified the delays, work with your stakeholders to try and figure out what could you do, what might you change, and then playing around with that virtual sandbox, your discrete event simulation, to see what might be the improvement, hopeful improvement, if you were to make certain changes. So pretty stock kind of discrete event simulation kind of thing. So we had 2 years of data they supplied us with from 2015 to 2016. And we saw, just doing some basic analysis of the data, that actually they did have very definite problems. Remember, the Cornwall was only dealing with the initial, from the point of initial referral to onward referral for their treatment at Plymouth, and the average time from initial referral to referral onwards for their treatment was about 89 days. Now, when you consider the 62-day referral to treatment target, that's way off where it needs to be. Okay, so there were clearly delays and problems in this part of the system. So the first thing to flag up really about this project is that back in the dark old days of PenCHORD in 2016, we were still using proprietary software. This is pre-FOSS. This is before we made the full move to developing all of our solutions in free and open source, using free and open source software and making models freely available. And actually, this is quite a good example of why we don't do this anymore. So this is using a piece of software called Simulate, a very popular piece of software for discrete event simulation. Quite a nice piece of software, does the job. It's got quite a nice graphical sort of drag and drop interface. I don't know how much Simulate is now. It certainly at the time was about £3,000 per license, depending on what you wanted to do. It's interesting to note, actually, in the very first HSMA program, we taught Simulate. That was all we did. We had a little 2-day Simulate course, and we got a deal from Simulate to give them free licenses for a year. And one of the things that came out of the very first evaluation of the very first HSMA program was, this is fantastic. We've got people really excited about modeling. Nobody can afford the licenses. And also there was a concern that, well, actually, if these people now move on, nobody else knows how to use this. Probably one of the most stark reasons for abandoning this kind of approach is that this model that I'm showing you here, I don't even know if I've still got it, and I certainly can't share it with you. And even if I could dig it out, you'd need a copy of Simulate, or I'd need to pay for a license to allow you to view the model online. It's not really the kind of way to go, and we believe very strongly in the PenCHORD team that if we're building and developing solutions that are impacting people's lives, that people have a right to be able to see what we've done and to be able to interrogate it and to be transparent about it, and also to make this freely available so that other hospitals, many of whom will likely have similar issues, can also share from that learning and can use that same model. And none of that could be done with the Simulate approach, or it's not just Simulate, any proprietary software approach. And so that was one of the main reasons, really, that we got fed up of saying to people when they say, oh, "This is great, can you share the model?" And we'd have to say, "No, we can't. I'm sorry." And that didn't sit right with us either as academics or as applied researchers working in the field of health. So that's kind of a bit of background into why we transitioned completely away from using any proprietary software. I mean, we went to the extremes. We've all got Linux now. But the key heart of this was we should be using free and open source approaches. We should be sharing the stuff we're doing. We should be making it transparent, and people should be able to interrogate it. And it shouldn't be the case that me sharing this model is me taking a screenshot of it and talking you through it. As nice as it is. Also worth flagging up, actually, that as nice as the simulate software is to use, and has some nice little visual capabilities, it can't do a lot of the stuff that even SymPy can. So when you're dealing with really, really large complex systems, you just can't do it. It just falls apart. So I want to give you that bit of background, because it's quite important for you to understand why we moved to free and open source. Normally by this point in the program you would have taken the Git training. That's obviously coming later. That's coming at the end of March. In the Git training we'll talk much more about why free and open source is so important, and it's more than just we like to use Linux. It's much more than that. It's much more fundamentally important than that. So we'll do a lot of talking in the Git session about why this stuff we believe is so important, and why all of our work is free and open source, and why the HSMA program only teaches free and open source methods. But anyway, getting back to the model, I wanted to flag that up. So as I say, it was built in Simulate, and this was basically an overview, rough overview of what their system was. These little containers here are your queues. The little plus icons here are your activities, your servers. The arrows are the sort of people flowing from one thing to another. And this is your generator, the start point, and this is a sink, your exit point from the system. So this should look familiar to you all in terms of discrete event simulation, even if you haven't seen Simulate before. But basically, patients would come in, they'd be referred into Royal Cornwall Hospital, normally through the GP, not always, but normally. They'd first get a cystoscopy. They then wait for a TURBT, which is a transurethral resection of the bladder tumor. At that point, two different things would need to happen. One would be that the case would need to be discussed at a local multidisciplinary team to discuss what needed to happen. And the second was that the patient needed to be contacted by a nurse specialist or a local urologist with the results of the TURBT, basically to tell them that they had bladder cancer, and what they were going to do about it, and to discuss with the patient their own treatment options. I'll come back a little bit more to that bit in a moment. Once both of those things happened, they would then be both referred on to the hospital in Plymouth, Derriford, and also referred to an oncologist. And once both of those things happen, all the referrals have been made, then their part of that journey through their part of the system, the Cornwall part of the system, would essentially end. But remember, they have not been treated at this point. They've been referred for treatment, so they're still waiting for their treatment. So we wanted to see, well, in this bit of the system, where are the delays? I can't remember where they thought they were, but they weren't where they turned out to be. So the first bottleneck turned out to be here. After they've had the cystoscopy and they're waiting for the TURBT, the wait was an average of 43 days, which is about, to put that in context, about 32% of their time in just the Cornwall part of the system. Okay, about a third of their time was just waiting for this TURBT. The second key bottleneck was waiting for the nurse specialist or the urologist to discuss the diagnosis with the patient, and to discuss the treatment options, to find out how the patient wanted to proceed, what they wanted to do. And that turned out to be on average about 25 days, or about a fifth of the time within this Cornwall part of the system. And what was quite stark that came out, and those of you who were here for the patient public involvement session on Tuesday will know that I talked about one thing that came out of this was when we were having the discussions about the process with the stakeholders. We had the urologists and the nurses and the administrators in the room. We were talking through what the process looked like. Something came up And it turned out that this bit here, where they were usually it was the nurse, or not always, but usually it was the nurse, was contacting the patient to discuss their treatment options and basically tell them they've got bladder cancer, was being done over the phone. And the urologist couldn't believe that that was actually happening, that people were being told they had cancer over the phone. And it was just such a demonstration of the importance of actually just doing the process. Man, we hadn't even done any modeling by this point, but actually just getting people in the same room together and talking about the system and how it's working, and finding out that people don't know sometimes, very often, what's going on in various parts of the system. So that had to immediately change. They were not happy with that for understandable reasons. And that links quite nicely actually to some of the stuff we were talking about on Tuesday around the patient public involvement. This is a project in retrospect that had we been doing this today, this would be ripe for getting a patient involved, getting their carers involved, to talk about this kind of stuff and why that isn't acceptable, and having a voice in that room to talk about what it means for them. This is a huge thing for them, and actually talking about the experience for them, and not just sort of seeing it as a system. But nonetheless, these were the two key bottlenecks, and other interesting information emerged as a result of that. So what we did was built the model, very, very simple discrete event simulation model, nothing complicated about it at all. And we basically demoed this model for the consultants, the urologists, the surgeons, the nurses were there in the room too. And we basically said, look, this is what's happening. You can see your system now. This is what's happening right now. What could you do about it? What are some of the ideas that you might have to try and reduce these delays? And basically what I did is I sat there and let them talk. And I have a little laptop in the corner of the room, and I had it beamed up to a large screen. And they'd come up with ideas, and I'd live test them in the model. I'd say, okay, you said this, let's have a go. Let's see what the model would say would happen. Would that work? Some things they suggested didn't seem to make a difference, but there were a couple things that jumped out, and those two things were: what if those patients who the consultants suspected to be muscle invasive patients, those where we need to try and catch them early, what if those patients were fast tracked such that they received their TURBT within at least 14 days of the cystoscopy? And that was basically them saying, well, do you know what, we are pretty good as consultants at identifying. We know where we think there are muscle invasive patients, and so basically trusting in their judgment to say, those ones that we think are muscle invasive at that early stage, we will fast track those patients so they get to their TURBT much more quickly. And the second change they wanted to look at was, well, what if the nurse spoke to the patient whilst they're on the ward having their TURBT, eliminating two problems. First, the getting rid of that sort of linear part of the process and bringing that forward so that those two things happen at once, and hopefully reducing the delay, but also, of course, meaning that the patient was actually spoken to in person and informed about it, and not told over the phone. Basically, we plugged this into the model, plugged in those changes, and the model predicted that if they did those things, the time from referral to treatment would reduce by 5.5 weeks, which was stark. Okay, over 5 weeks of waiting would be shaved off the system, which is huge and really significant, particularly for muscle invasive bladder cancer patients. And this was so stark that it had an immediate impact as I was sat there, and we tested this in the model. Basically, the cancer lead for urology got up and said, I'm going off now to rewrite this protocol, and we are making this change. And he did that, and 24 hours later, he emailed me and said, we've rewritten the protocol. This is in, I think that was on the Friday. We're putting this in place from Monday, and it's going to go in. Okay, and we're going to do things this way now. And it was I've never seen anything where it was such a stark result that caused such an immediate impact. So the following May, the collaborators that have been working with sent us, they've been collecting some data about how things had panned out. And they wanted us to have a look at it and see what we thought about it, and see if the changes that they've made so swiftly had actually had a result. And boy, they had. So it turns out this is the real world results now, not the model. This is actually what happened. They found that the mean time from referral to the transurethral resection of the bladder tumor had reduced by 3.5 weeks for fast track patients, those that were suspected to be muscle invasive, and also, interestingly, 9 days across all patients. And you might think, well, why is that? Surely, if you're fast tracking certain patients, there's going to be a knock-on effect for other patients. We think what was happening was that because they'd suddenly become so invested in their system, other processes were starting to speed up too, and they were really thinking about what they were doing in every stage of the process. And we've seen this time and again in operational research, where you go in with a model and they make changes, but the process of looking at the system as a whole leads to wider improvement, because they start to look at the system as a whole and look to see where they can make other improvements as well. So as well as that, we had if you look from the mean time from referral to being contacted by the nurse specialist, that reduced by 5 weeks for fast track patients, and again 11 days across all patients. So everyone seemed to be really benefiting from this. And a very simple graph here, just showing how stark this is. So the dotted line here being the 62-day referral to treatment target. The blue bars here was what was happening before the changes. So this is the time from referral to the TURBT. This is the time from referral to contact by the nurse specialist. Remember, this isn't even treatment at this stage. And already they're way above where they need to be. And then the red bar is what happened post-change for all bladder cancer patients. And then the purple is for the fast tracks, who are the suspected muscle-invasive patients. And you can see this stark reduction, really giving them much more breathing space to allow for them to be referred and treated at Plymouth. So it was we actually got this paper published in the Journal of Clinical Urology. And there's a link to it there, but you do need a subscription for that. So because we are very much free and open source now, you can see a pre-proof of the article at this link here, and I'll share these slides after the session too, where you can read the paper free of charge as well. And really the key thing I wanted to sort of flag up from all of this is that hopefully this has given you a bit of insight into the significant difference that a bit of modeling, and really very extremely simple modeling, there was nothing complex about that at all, incredibly simple discrete event simulation model, but the stark difference that could make to people's lives, potentially saving people's lives just from that very simple model, and just going to speak to people about the system, getting them to think about their system and how they might improve it. The second thing was hopefully a demonstration of why we do free and open source now, because if we were doing this now, this would be a free and open model, and it would be shared widely, and the paper would be in an open journal. And thirdly, just thinking about the importance of the patient voice in this. Again, if we did this now, I'd want patient involvement right from the author talking about their experiences, and those kind of things would crop up much more quickly. And there may have been other things that they were not aware of that were happening to patients that they just didn't know about or hadn't really thought about in that way. And so this is a perfect demonstration, I think, of why you would want a patient voice in that room for what is a relatively simple model, but which can have such a stark impact for people's lives. And it really did. So hopefully it's a bit of both a cautionary tale, but also a bit of inspiration about how this kind of stuff, these numbers that you're chucking through in what you might consider to be relatively simple models, actually can make a huge difference in the real world for real people. And let's not forget, that's why you're doing it. That's why you're doing your HSMA projects. This is the whole reason we do what we do within the PenCHORD team, to see stuff like this. Okay, I will stop there and open up for any questions. Please do shout if I don't see your hand as well. Oh, Elliot, yes, you got your hand up.
Thank you very much for that. I've just kind of got a question. I think maybe it may benefit.
Oh, sorry, Elliot, I can't hear you. I don't know if it's. I'm wondering if it's my settings. Hold on, it might be me. Can somebody put a thumbs up if they can hear Elliot? Okay.
How about now?
Oh, that's better. There you go.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so as I say, this question, it may benefit others who are thinking about their projects themselves, and I'm sorry if I've missed it. But how is the data quality? Because obviously one of the biggest things about projects is that you can come up with these amazing ideas, and I experienced it myself when I was working on my project last summer. But it just takes time to A, get the data, and B, for example, I had the wrong endpoints, and so I was looking at the wrong target variable. And I'm just wondering if you had anything like that you could share with everyone.
Yeah, so to answer your question, how's the data quality? Appalling and non-existent would be the truthful answer. They were basically, we got lucky because they didn't routinely collect any data whatsoever, other than I think when they came in and when they left, and that was it. And so it was quite stark seeing the lack of data. Now, we got lucky because at the time, I think for the previous period of however many years, I think it was 2 years, they had this guy, this poor guy, who was basically manually entering this stuff. They then needed to go and cross-check some extra stuff for the modeling, and he had to go back through and sift through this data all by hand to try and get the information that we needed, and it was an absolute nightmare. I mean, he left shortly after, and then ironically went on to Plymouth, and then we were going to do a project with Plymouth, and they said, oh, I think you know the data guy, and his face dropped. Oh no, not again. Yeah, in honesty, if it hadn't been for what he did, that project would not have been. We wouldn't have been able to do it. And so it was only because they had they felt they knew for some time that there was something wrong in the system, so they had the kind of foresight to we ought to try collecting a bit more data than we're doing, and it was only because of that we were able to just about scrape together a model. And part of the reason it was such a simple model was because the data was so lacking, but it was enough to get them to the point of saying, well, look, we can see where your delays are, and it was enough to get them thinking about what they could do. But yeah, it was atrocious.
Cool, thank you very much.
Zagal, I think you got your hand up as well.
Yes, hi, thanks, Dan. Really, really interesting. And also, I guess, important to see the scope for how big the project should be, because when I bring it to my stakeholders, they all say, we want to model everything in the hospital. Yay, we got this resource. And I'm like, no, one pathway, one. But I guess the question is, what did you actually, when you sat with your clinicians or with the people who, and that process map, what did you show them? What did it look like? Because I find that if I just show them numbers, they don't believe you. Mm-hmm. If you just show them summary numbers, they don't believe you. Mm-hmm. Did you actually show them something moving in a simulation that they went, oh, we can see this? And if
yes.
So, how do we then translate that to our free software, which doesn't have that kind of interface that Simulate might have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that is one key advantage of Simulate, that you could see sort of people flowing around, and that's exactly what we showed them, and it was quite powerful actually showing them that. And they could see they could see the difference. I could put in the changes, and they see what would happen, the queues building up, etc. as well. So you're absolutely right, that is a key advantage, and it is something that is lacking actually in SimPy. Now there are various sort of solutions around that allow you to get around it. So some of the previous HSMA projects have used things within R and put the data into R and shown it within a kind of Shiny app, or shown people flowing down, getting that same sort of idea of people flowing and queues building up within certain parts of the within the process. some of the network analysis stuff that Elliot will touch on is actually quite useful for some of this stuff as well, because it shows essentially people linking different parts of the system and uses graph theory, and you can actually use some of that stuff to show queues building up and sort of dynamic network graphs as well. So it's an interesting point. I think one of the key things if you're doing any discrete event simulation is thinking about how you communicate this with stakeholders. So for the end of life care modeling, which I talked about in before Christmas, that was a SymPy based model, and the way we did that there was I actually built a little model of the flow in Insight Maker, which we used for system dynamics on Tuesday, to give them a feel about what their system looked like. And then we were quite careful about the kind of the outputs, how we generated the visualizations for the outputs, so they could understand what was happening. But it is an interesting area, and it's something. There is a spin-off of SymPy called Salabim, which had a lot. We had a little look at it a few years back. It never took off as much as SymPy did, which is a shame because it had actually quite nice visualization capabilities built in. But and it's also built around SymPy 2, which is quite different as the older version, and didn't really get updated. There is stuff going on in the team where we're trying to look at some of this stuff and look at building on interfaces. But a lot of the way in which previous HSMAs, for example, have approached this is building shiny web apps and actually having an interactive tool. You can say this is how the system works, and having that kind of a very clear diagram to show how the system is structured, and then allowing them to interact with it and showing these powerful visualizations in terms of where the queues are building up, etc. as well. So that tends to be how it's done at the moment. But one of the things we've got lined up potentially for masterclass in phase 2 is actually looking at some of this visualization stuff, including building some Streamlit apps and Shiny apps and things like that, but also looking at some of the ways in which some of our colleagues have sort of got around this issue, and looking at different ways in which you might kind of visualize that kind of information. It's I think it's a real shortcoming of SymPy, because something like Mesa, for example, has fantastic visualization out of the box for agent-based simulation, but SymPy doesn't. It is an area that's lacking.
Thank you.
There is. Any other questions? Sorry.
Just hi.
Hi.
I was just gonna ask Dan. So, have you had the chance to revisit? I mean, those changes are made now. There's better quality of data. Have you had the chance to revisit that? Or
no, no is the answer. I'm hoping that there is better quality of data, although
yeah, I found that the same. Is most of the times it's just a one-off thing. You just engage once and then never called again.
Yeah, and I think that's for me. That's another. It's a real. And a lot of the stuff that we've done historically within the team has been these kind of what we're almost termed disposable models, where you've got a problem, we'll come along, we build a little model, there you go, you can use that now, and then you chuck it away. And although that changed a little bit as we moved towards free and open source, because obviously we're now saying, well, we're not chucking the model away, we're now sharing it so other people can see that. But there is still that element of, well, how much is it being used? How is that still in place today? What does it look like now? So yeah, it's a real area that there's no kind of easy answers, but I think for me, part of the reason for doing HSMA, as well as giving you all the power to support you to do these kind of projects yourselves, is also to build that in-house capacity, so that the organization actually has something in-house where you can do this kind of stuff, and it becomes an ongoing thing rather than a let's call in an expert as a one-off thing, and then we take the results. Great, we've made the change, brilliant, see you, thanks. So trying to change that as well is a little bit actually a case in point. One of the projects, it wasn't this project, but one of the projects, one of the HSMAs from the very first cohort, in fact it was an HSMA from Cornwall, he was an analyst at the time that he did his HSMA project. He's now part of the exec team and basically heads up a kind of sub team of modelers. and we did a project a few years back where we worked with Cornwall, and then we handed over basically to him, and then he took that sort of forward, and it was really nice actually seeing the work then being sort of continued in-house, and I've heard it sort of referenced since. So I think that model of trying to build embedded researchers is something that's quite important in what we're trying to do, I think, with this.
Yeah, just what I found, like for like dynamic visualizations, I mean, it takes a bit of a learning curve, but is a library called Dookie, and that is, I mean, is quite good for dynamic stuff. It just takes a little bit of learning curve. So BOKEH.
Oh, okay.
And that is very good.
Could you pop a link to that in the Slack?
Yeah,
that would be great, because I think it might be good to check that out, and it might be something I get Elliot to have a look at as part of the masterclass, because I think that would be really nice to explore stuff like that. I think it's definitely an area that we want to, there's so much more you can do with SimPy than you can with Simulate, but that is the one area where it is lacking, and you do lose something, and you have to think a bit more carefully. So yeah, looking at other solutions for that, I think would be really nice.
Yeah, I'll do that now. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Okay, apologies, so we've overrun slightly, but hopefully that was interesting and useful for you. We'll put the recording up too. Apologies, I haven't got round to the lecture from Tuesday. I haven't forgotten. I will try and do that hopefully today. But thank you for coming along, and look forward to seeing you, those of you on the current program, on Tuesday, where Elliot's going to be taking over the teaching reins and telling us all, including me, about geographic modelling. Brilliant. See you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.